Welcome to the last lecture in the series on Indian economy. Having discussed about history, geography and cultural aspects of Indian economy already, you should be interested in knowing more about India's economic dimensions, as it is momentous at this point in time when we are discussing about Indian economy and the rest of the world. As you see, if you look at the Indian economy's macro outlook, India stands at the 5th position in terms of GDP, that is national income, almost alongside the major developed countries like United States or United Kingdom in the world. If you look at Spain's position in the ranking, it is at the 15th position, which considerably distant from India. Nonetheless, Spain is considerably very small country to India in its size, stock of population, or even in terms of volume of trade that the people or the economy can do. So it is not to say that the volume of money in terms of GDP is good at India, but to give you a macro outlook that how India is gigantic when we talk about major economies in the world. Now, why do we have Indian economy in discussion today across the globe, especially when we talk about global south, where the developing countries like India and China are located? So conventionally in economics, we say there are 4 factors of production, or production function is molded around land, labor, capital and organization as the 4 functional characteristics that creates value, economic value for an economy. And technology could be the modern last addition or latest addition. So if you look at India, India has all of these things in abundance. That means India is one of the major country in terms of its geographic space, mass. And also it is number 1 in terms of its population, that is labor otherwise. And it is also number 5 in GDP in the world, which means that there is huge money or capital that can create more economic value here. The 4th aspect, naturally, organization is built up on both capital and labor, which are abundant already in India. So if you look at India's scenario in terms of entrepreneurship, for example, you will see that India stands as one of the major countries for startups or unicorns in the world. Adding fuel to that, technological sector in India is ever growing or rapidly growing in the recent years. So especially in the field of information and technology or otherwise computer science. But India was not so for so many years or decades. As you know, India was decolonized from British Empire back in 1947, and India had a struggleful history of economic development throughout these 7.5 decades of its history. So let's quickly go to how it was in the past and how it is today before we pause some of the criticism, as I already mentioned in the title card, that there is some considerable amount of inequality, economic inequality that exists in the economy. So the post-independence economy of India, starting from 1947, was largely rural and agrarian. Agrarian or rural economy can add up very few value or considerably lower value compared to industrial sector or service sector in an economy. So, no question, undoubtedly, it was poor, leaving almost 3/4 of the total population living under poverty or similar aspects, and so on and so forth. Post-independence, India, under the leadership of the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, had taken up a policy that we will follow 5-year plans modeling the erstwhile Russia, USSR. And the idea behind 5-year plans were that the resources in India are limited and we need to really focus on some sectors, not on all at a given shot. So we prioritize naturally agriculture, irrigation, power, or basic infrastructure that foster agricultural development and create more value in the economy. And surprisingly, it was working too, and there was a modest growth in the first decade after independence in India, and agricultural production was accelerating. That gave an impression of succeeding in the journey, so that the second 5-year plan in India was naturally on the infrastructure or the industrial sector, which was not so successful as the previous one was. During this period, from 50s to 60s, which is largely referred as Nehruvian vision, named after Jawaharlal Nehru, as I already mentioned, who established the landmark institutions in the country. So, for example, like Indian Institute of Technology was his idea. So, emphasis on industrialization and self-sufficiency for industrialization was always there, and these sort of institutions were paving path towards it. On the parallel, on the other hand, there was also an emphasis on development of public sector, though we declared we are adopting a mixed economy model, which is nothing but a balance between public sector and private sector. But though we say it's a mixed economy then, it was more of a socialist economy, which emphasized on public sector investment over private investment. So there were challenges also, like slow industrial growth, slow growth of the economy, and which kept the economy stunted on growth for a few decades then until 1990s, which we'll come to discuss in due course. Following this phase, there was a crisis time also in Indian economy with regard to poverty in 70s, that we were kind of having shortage of food supply for the large population mass in the country, and we were also relying on huge imports from the other countries in the world, especially the developed countries, for even surviving on hunger of the people. It was not so a good scenario for an economy, not even for a society, to depend on some other country to have the food intake. So the so-called Green Revolution, which was very successful and notable in the history then, under the leadership of M.S. Swaminathan, was brought in India, emphasizing on, say, influence of science, research and development in agricultural sector. So there were chemical and science-infused variety of seeds that could give more production in agricultural sector, food grain or surplus, compared to the earlier scenarios. Agriculture in India was always rural and traditional, so that low yielding. Now with the infusion of Green Revolution, it was double, triple or even more than that at point in time. So it created huge reduction of shortages in food supply in India, and it also helped India to reduce the imports and reliance on other economies for its own food supply, which naturally led to socio-economic progress like improvement in rural income, reduction in regional disparities in terms of development in India. Economic challenges in 70s was not only limited to the food supply but also extended to standard GDP growth, national income growth, paralleled by inflation, high inflation, not surprisingly fueled by oil shocks in 1970s due to war scenarios between US and Iran sort of countries at that point in time. So India was also getting stagnated by these external pressures and also due to policy failures in India. Some of the policy measures against this was taken during the same period was again towards socialist aspect of the economy, that more nationalizations took place, like nationalization of a number of banks in India, introduction of license Dutch, which literally translate into license administration, that government need to approve each of the entrepreneurial or capital related activities in India, so there were more administrative red tapeism in India, and it further impacted slow growth in Indian economy during the time. This crisis, which let's say began somewhere in the late 60s and it continued through 70s due to the factors within India, plus due to the factors from the rest of the world, reached a a saturation point towards end of 80s. And India was kind of forced to take a new economic policy in the beginning of 1990s, which we name as 1991 economic reform. The immediate pressure on India to adopt liberalization policy in India in 1991 was the pressure from IMF on its balance of payment crisis. When India met the balance of payment crisis in early 1990s, India was forced by IMF or similar funding agencies to take up an open economy policy against this socialist closed aspect towards capitalization and investments. So the key of this reform is popularly known as LPG, which stands for L liberalization, P privatization, and G globalization. The larger aspect of this policy was that Indian economy was open for the rest of the globe totally, and it includes foreign direct investments to India. Privatization was motivated as against Nehruvian policy of concentration on PSUs, so that disinvestment on PSUs has happened. Liberalization opened up more revenues for private people to venture in the economy. So there is less regulation or no regulation deviating from the erstwhile license rationality. So this was a momentous change in Indian economy, that everything was reversed and it was running towards more of a capitalized economy from a socialized economy. So the impact was the biggest, that there was rapid acceleration of economic growth, cashing on sectors in which India had advantages. So FDI inflow has definitely grown up. Similarly, service sector was growing, cashing on the people who are educated, cashing on the huge population, which can be translated as cheap labor for service sector in other way. Following this liberalization paradigm or shift in paradigm from socialist era to capitalist era in India, India has seen huge growth and development from 1990s, and it attained momentum in 2000s, and the repercussions are still seen. As you see, India is the fifth largest economy today in terms of GDP volume or the value of GDP. So there was definitely economic boom, there was definitely GDP growth acceleration year after year. IT and software services boom, as you see today, that like India or Indian firms or Indian companies, Indian labor is known for its engineering technology, science related to computer and computer software is coming somewhere from here, that the bloom has happened over the privatization of the sector, and foreign direct investment was possible and more globalization avenues were opened up. So there were even times or places like Bangalore, for example. Bangalore is a city from India, which is called as India's Silicon Valley, replicating Silicon Valley from US. Rapid urbanization was another aspect of this capitalization of Indian economy, that there were hubs of industrialization, like say for example in South India, you see Chennai as a city has attracted a lot of ventures from outside to set up their industries over there, right in down south of India, to manufacture more, like let's say China did, for example, Mache. So it also kind of created Indian multinationals, companies or people, and global presence of Indian companies across the globe by the free flow of the commodity, by the free flow of the goods or people or money. So growth was a definite phenomenon, and it actually ventured in certain sectors like consumer goods or automobiles, for example. Though economic liberalization in India has given India a momentous growth over time of like 3 decades, it was not only the outcome of the growth. The growth has its own issues, say for example like inflation, corruption to a certain extent, and definitely economic inequality. Some of the major events associated with this time period are, say for example, demonetization in 2016 and goods and services tax implementation in 2017 as to be noted. While economic inequality was increasing and inflation was also hitting people equally as economic evils, especially the middle class or the poor in India, there were additional burdens on people like demonetization, which ruled out or invalidated high denominations of Indian currencies overnight in the name of, let's say, chasing black money, which was not a successful attempt for the economy. So it further impacted people to bear more pain of the economic policy while they were not actually involved in the economic policy. It was not good for anything or anyone so far in the given scenario of demonetization that happened in 2016, while some other policies which are very crucial for the Indian economy, like GST, goods and services tax, created a uniform umbrella for indirect taxes that are operational in India. As you may already know that India is a fiscal federal country. There is governments in tiers, that there is a union government which we refer as Government of India, and then there are 28 Indian states and 8 union territories, put together 36 subdivisions or states of India. They all have individual governments and they also have economic policies, budgets and tax policies. So when there were too many states like this and there were too many state tax policies on indirect tax also in India before GST, so it was creating kind of a cascading effect which burdens on the economy and economic activity, or sometimes demotivate the economic agent to operate in the economy because the tax compliances are nexus of difficulty. GST kind of removed the cascading effect of or the laborious activities related to the indirect tax payment in India and brought it in one single umbrella, creating economic operations in the country easier from end to end. Similarly, some of the government initiatives that could have added colors to India's growth are Make in India, which promoted manufacturing in India as a competition to cheap manufacturing from China predominantly. Similarly, Digital India motivated having more digital friendly, technology friendly infrastructure in India, which has actually gained some momentum in the globe that we'll see in one of the future slides in this lecture. And startup blooming in India was also a result of India's governance policy to have more entrepreneurial activity in the economy. Now, having said a brief of the economic history of India from 1947 to 2024 today, let's look at the growth of India as an economy and also some of the shortfalls of Indian economy parallel. As you see on the picture, that I am making a quick comparison of India's GDP growth or whatever indicator that I am showing over here with in relation to UK, USA, China and Spain. Spain is contextual here as this lecture is related to. China is an Asian competitor to Indian economy. US and UK, you can consider it as like two prominent economies which are largely capitalist in the world. So if you look at the growth of GDP as of the latest data, you see the growth is consistent and it is positive. Though you look at China and US, it is huge and it is hugely different from India. India's growth path is always consistent. It was never a fall short largely, and it is actually still standing above UK, which actually ruled India prior to its independence. If you look at the volume of GDP at the current prices as given by IMF, most of these data are mapped from International Monetary Fund, IMF data mapper. And you see India is at par with, equivalent with any developed country in the world in terms of GDP today. So it's equally a grown-up country compared to USA or UK or Spain or China or whatever it is, or Russia. But it is more attractive to see this, that growth of GDP. The earlier picture has told you that we have grown, or we are, say, in one of the 5 countries of GDP growth in the world. But if you look at the growth rate, India is actually surpassing, fast running than the developed countries itself. If you compare with USA, for example, or Canada, for example, or UK, for example, you see India's share is more darker, indicating that there are more than consistently greater than 6% growth in annual GDP of India compared to any other country in the world, including China for that matter. So this gives momentum of attraction for India, that India is fast growing and it will continue to grow faster compared to the countries that we have already discussed. Now, is it only about GDP? Certainly the answer is no. If you look at the trade here means international trade, and the group of the countries of comparison is the same. And if you look at the trade volume, growth and its shortfalls, you see India is again consistent at par with the global trend. Whatever trend that UK follows or China follows is same as India follows. So the dips and downs that you see are global, which are consistent across the world economy. So India definitely have been growing even in terms of international trade there. It is more interesting if you look at the export value alone. Trade includes trade in terms of import and export put together. If we delineate it into export alone for that matter and see India's and China's export value is growing compared to the major countries like USA and UK for that matter. So you see, like, the potential export is actually translation of potential production in that particular economy. We export, economies export when they have surplus production, when they are able to make surplus production and send it across the globe. So India and China, they are the forerunners in the field in terms of value of trade. Now, something which is kind of unrelated to an economic activity would be remittances from the rest of the world. Here India is hugely cashy, that the other sort of values that are transacted between a country and the other country is based on goods and services that are sent or received. Here, India has a advantage of having huge potential population, and they are continuously migrating outside India. On a rough estimate, around 2.5 million Indians are annually migrating outside India, especially looking forward to developed countries. So these people, after reaching out to the respective economies, are sending money back to Indian economy, which we technically call as remittances, are huge in India, which is far away from even from China, which is equally populous as India. This added to India's growth like anything, especially in terms of private investment, infrastructural development, real estate, education, etc. Now, if we look at the industrial growth, which includes construction, which actually tells us that the economy is structurally improving from an agrarian economy to a manufacturing economy, or rural economy to a modern economy, then the trends are again consistent with the world economies, that the industrialization is at par with any other world economy that we have discussed already. The trends, up-down trends, are similar to USA or UK or China, and the volumes are close by. It's not like farther than any other country in the group. Similarly, if you look at the improvement or annual growth of service sector for that matter, again India and China are leading, and their trends are very close by. Sometimes some of the countries are picking up, sometimes some are falling down, but largely on an average the trend is set alongside the major countries in the world. So someone would question at this point in time that, is everything economically good in India, and are they influenced by economic factors alone? Say for example, we are talking about huge remittances, huge money coming into India. We are saying about huge volume of export that is happening from India. we are talking about GDP growth of at its peak compared to any other country in the world is from India. Is that the only reason behind the growth or success story, especially in the recent times in Indian economy? Actually speaking, no. It is not only the GDP and the trade chases the growth. It is actually some of the social advantages of India that is also playing it out. So, what are all? The first and foremost is the population or human capital in modern terms. If you look at the graph, again, among the 4 or 5 countries that we have been comparing, that India's and China's population are growing forever. There is no question about it. But look at the end of the graph that India is slightly surpassing China, like in the recent times, or the gap between India and China in terms of population is thinner and thinner, and India is now the #1 populous country in the world. So the population that are between age 15 and 64 are considered to be the employable population that creates value for the economy as labor. So China was actually having the advantage of having maximum population at this age category for a couple of decades in the past, and now they are trailing, where India is taking that position as of now, and from now onwards it is estimated that another 2 to 3 decades India will have this demographic dividend as at its peak or prime time. So it is also telling us that the Indian economy will further grow faster, given that the population is at their prime age, they are mostly educated, they are digitalized, and they are actually having capacities in terms of entrepreneurial skills, or having more export value, or having more technological development that create more value in the economy. So the population growth is actually a predominant indicator that the economy is about to grow faster than what it is today by having it in its prime age population. Now, the population in discussion has also to be dealt in terms of poverty, because population without having sufficient intakes of resources will not be able to make economic value. Poverty and the concept of vicious cycle of poverty explains that a person or a country or a society or an economy that is being poor or born poor is likely to settle down in poverty in the cycle of life. And that is basically because the access to resources, productive income, capital is less in such scenarios. India, as a country that hails from Asia, which was once colonized, exploited, had the lack of resources in the past, and this lack of resources was persistent across so many decades for India, and it was broken maybe after the new economic policy in India, because capital was no longer an issue, and India started picking up on the growth, the momentous growth at par with the developed world in the world economy, and now reaching out to saying that it is a major economy or it's the fastest growing economy in the world. It explains that India's poverty has reduced considerably, as you see, over time from 70s to now. It has fallen somewhere from 70% of the people living in some sort of poverty to around 10 to 15% of the total population are falling under poverty in some version. Of course, China or other countries which are leading are at the bottom level. They are the top in this category, but reduction from a huge figure to this figure is remarkable in case of India. Another macroeconomic aspect that could be of interest is that unemployment scenario in the economy. So if you look at unemployment, this again the proportion of people who are unemployed while they are actually eligible to be employed are falling in India, as in all the countries, and some of the countries in the West, such as Spain, is actually kind of indicating another trend that the unemployment is getting high in those economies, whereas by and large the other countries like USA or UK are at par with India or China, which is always having an unemployment issue but in a bearable proportion. And in case of India, the data is discontinuous or not available. And with whatever available data, or as of the modern data, the latest data, it shows that India's unemployment is at par with the global unemployment maybe. Adding to the momentous growth of population, their prime age, their capacity to create more economic value and low rate of unemployment and poverty. Also parallel with digital revolution or technological improvement in India. If you look at the data that is given from the Press Information Bureau of Government of India, India tops the global digital payment system in the world. So in terms of digital payment, which is kind of a feature that can be a feature of a very modern developed society, is high in India in terms of its volume, which indicates that India's technological acquaintance is far greater than, or it's very accelerated, it is so accelerated than some of the other countries which are hugely populous or economically developed for that matter. 2 or 3 things behind the scenario is again improved education, health and standard of living in India and Indian people. Having said the fairy tale, the merits and achievements of India already, and we have explained enough that India is growing, it continues to grow, and there are both economic and social aspects that contributed and keep contributing to its growth. We are also looking at, we should also explain about the other side of the coin, that India is also known for its inequality, which is also growing parallel to its economic growth. We are not going to discuss all of it, but I would like to give some hints and indications that what are all the probable dimensions of inequality and why are they problematic in a growing economy like India. So at this figure, you find out that the one in the insight is the one that we have seen already, that India is the fastest or one of the fastest growing country in terms of GDP, which is even competent to US. And look at the current picture, current graph, which is again from IMF, that explains about GDP per capita. What is GDP per capita? It's the GDP divided across the population of the country. So if the GDP is divided across the Indian population, then India falls somewhere on the middle class economy or averagely developed or barely developed economy, leaving a lot of other countries who are like well developed, which you see in the highlight blue, and the highlight slowly reddish or slowly in orange is indicating that it's just an average performer, and India is one of the average performers along with a lot of African and South American countries, while it actually exists as kind of number 1 in terms of the growth of GDP. So what it explains is that the growth or the higher GDP or high amount of money or capital in India is actually vested, concentrated in few pockets, maybe with few people, few investors, few monopolies. It is not distributed equally among them. Or the population of India is huge and its distribution is very unequal in a way that the country is a medium performer in terms of GDP per capita. So income inequality continue to grow. There are a lot of reports citing India's concerning growth of income inequality in recent times. Is it only economic inequality that is growing? Certainly the answer is no. We have, say for example, Human Development Index or development indexes that consider factors other than economic factors also, such as HBI from UNDP, United Nations Development Program. And if you look at the picture and of a comparison between India, China and Spain is contextual again, because Spain or any other country from the West or Europe will be on the top only since historic time because of the historic advantages. And you can also see there is a world average, and India and China both started having its HDI value or rank below the world average, but China picked it up around 2010 and it's now above world average value. But India consistently continued to be parallel to world average, indicating that there is a very negligible growth or slow-paced growth of human development in the country, despite its education or health or standard of living or technological advancement that we have already discussed and being celebrated, which indicates that there is persistent inequality still continuing in India. Now look at another scenario which could be again universal, called Gender Development Index. Gender Development Index is gender sensitized human development index. That if human development index can be dissected for men and women separately, and what is women's position, then India's performance is even poorer compared to HDI. That India and China, as already we have seen it in HDI, is below the world average. China picked it up again somewhere around 2006, 7, 8. India still continued to be under the world average and parallel to the world average, indicating that there is a standard growth or like a very meager progress that we can only see in decimals over that. And these data are being translated over 3 decades from 1990s, where we exactly situate India's economic growth backed by new economic policy 1981. That is where it is contrast that on one end economically it is booming and the other end shows that there is continuing or growing inequality in the same country. If you also look at the employment scenario and the disparity, and using gender disparity as one of the disparities that are possible because it is universal. So for example, in India we have like social disparity in terms of caste system, but which will not be very universal. That some country like maybe Spain wouldn't be, Spanish context would not be easily understandable to see or analyze how caste mechanism works in an economy. So gender, the difference between men and women and their opportunities or resources are universal and it's just everywhere debated. So if you look at the unemployment scenario in India, we say unemployment is controlled and it is at par with the global scenario and everything is being equal. The difference between unemployment of men and women continue to be around 50% different across the years, all over 90s to 2020. It seems that the gap between chances to participate in labor by women have never improved in India, despite its all improvements paralleling this time. Moving forward, I would like to add up this to the discussion as the end. Is this inequalities because India is not taking any policy measures or so, or India is not interested in a policy measure to address this? Somebody could say no, and someone can also say yes. I'll say yes and no, because if you look at the current picture which are on screen, that it explains about gender budgeting map in the globe. Gender budgeting is a financial policy that relates to budget and tax policies in the corresponding economy, and that can be gender sensitized. Gender budgeting comes as a policy understanding that budgetary policies in a country, which is huge and it is coming from government and it involves money, acknowledging that there is gender inequality in a country, in the respective economy, and we need to sensitize the money dispersal in a way that it addresses the gender inequality. That is the policy. And India, globally, is a prominent gender budgeting country. There are data and study research indicating that India has done a lot in the policy and its execution and research on it. But if you look at the counter part of the same data regarding gender inequality that it should have addressed, India is so reddish, indicating that gender inequality is so high in India. That in the insight you see, India is a prominent gender budgeting country which is taking steps towards curbing gender inequality in the society, even through finances. But the same picture is then if you see for inequality, gender inequality in the same economy, India ranks bottom along with again Latin American, African countries. We're leaving all the other compared countries, the world leading countries are leading in terms of more equal society. So what it actually indicates is that policies are there, but maybe not addressing the issues due to some policy issues, or due to some data issues, or due to some execution issues. There need to be more mechanisms to figure it out that why it is not working. But one of the aspects is that the societal construction, societal composition in India is patriarchal, it is stereotypical, it is divided, and there are more, or there is still more influence, still more efforts that are required to address this issue, which is not yet happened or which has not been realized yet. In order to conclude, let's ask that, is this explaining that the decades ahead are India's? The answer is yes. With all the existing inequality issue or shortfall issue or problems issues, with all the concerns that we have already discussed as in terms of inequality, India is definitely going to grow, and it is a proper runway for takeoff among the global economies in the world. And India is precisely, as Morgan Stanley explains, India is precisely about to take China's path of hyper growth in the upcoming decades. This is because, as I explained, it's already been generating a lot of GDP growth, annual growth already, backed by the demographic dividend. Huge population at their young age is going to translates into India's hyper growth as China did in the past decades. India so have several advantages, as I already explained. Beside demographic dividends, there is a geopolitics that is favoring the global economies to de-risk from China, internationally speaking, that if not China, who is the next is then India. And the global de-risking from the relations of China is possible by having more trade with India. And the sectors in India are getting cleaned up. As I already told you, there were macro policies as demonetization or GST that has happened in India. But there are policies like Make in India or Digital India or Startup India that are motivating those respective sectors to be more economic, efficient and corruption free. So the sectors are now cleansed for having more competition and more value creation. The other edge of the growth would be digitalization, as we already explained. The economy is already in a transition stage of digitalization, despite its illiteracy or poverty or something of that sort. In India, for example, you will not see huge stores or air-conditioned stores or only shopping malls that accepts, say, digitalized payment. Even a local street vendor in India today would have a QR code asking you to pay in digital. That amount of technological growth has already gone to the roots of India, and we only need to push it further. So there is definitely a huge potential in tapping by technology. Plus, there is a growth in global offshoring that sees India as kind of a hub where they can offshore their work from their respective economies, because the value of the economy, value of the cost that they have to put for that business will be lower or cheaper in India. So this global offshoring will give further capital flow or money flow to India. Parallel to that, if you go around India, India is infrastructurally booming. Infrastructural sector is flourishing like anything in India, that there are construction happening everywhere, right from the real estate, housing, dwelling constructions to roads, railways to metros or airports, and it is never ending. All the major urban agglomerations in India, all the major states in India, across you see that construction is a never-ending thing. So it also indicates that there is a huge multiplier effect, that the money poured into this infrastructural sector will multiply into many in the allied sectors. So, for example, manufacturing sector in India is going to be one of the major beneficiary of this infrastructural development in India. So, is it all good again and the India's decade ahead is very bright? Now there is a small note saying that India's future will be bright and it will attract momentum of growth again due to all these factors, provided we pay attention to the human capital. As said by the former RBI governor, Reserve Bank of India governor, Rajan, that India need to pay attention more on the human capital it has because it is naturally abundant. It is given. We need not to create more labor or more human. It is already there. We need only to entrain them, upskill them, educate them to create more value in the economy. And this educated, trained or skilled labor from India is not only benefiting India from the domestic sphere, it is also giving India huge remittances, as we have already seen in the earlier segment, that a lot of money is being flown from the rest of the world to India through the human capital. So we really need to, India really need to pay attention to its human capital. That's all. I'm concluding my talk for today. Thank you so much.